the veil drawn down to her chin, bundled in furs, clutching her skirts in both hands like a woman hastily dressed, the little Baroness stepped quickly into the street, where the morning fog still wept. She paused for a moment on tiptoe, seemed uncertain, looked right, then left, with the nervous, darting gestures of a bird perched on a branch, unsure which way to take flight. Then, almost running, she climbed into a cab, tossing the driver an address. No sooner had she curled herself into a corner, shivering, perhaps afraid, her lips hidden in her muff amid the warmth of silk and velvet, than something slipped from beneath her cloak in a glimmer of rose and black, a satin corset. Velvet traced the empty curves where once her breasts had swelled. What? The Baroness, an elegant woman of the world, no less, looked at that moment like one of those little morning streetwalkers, mincing through the city, who, in their sloth, have neglected to don again the fragile whalebone armour whose nightly defeats have proved its uselessness. She did not pick up the corset. She was thinking of that guilty and enchanting night in the bachelor's apartment, where her boudoir perfume had mingled with the scents of Russian leather and fine cigars, drifting among walls hung with antique weapons beneath crossed fencing foils. She was thinking of the frenzy of sudden embraces, of buttons torn open with impatient hands, and of the long, slow, endless caresses where first boldness and first refusals melt into languor. Now and then she glanced toward the street, tinged pink in places, still mostly grey. Beneath carriage porches, milkmen were lining up their tin cans with copper lids. A newspaper boy stationed before a half-opened shop was handing out the morning papers to an old woman barely awake, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Office clerks, thin, dark, with croissants between their teeth, hurried past with coat collars upturned, hugging the walls. But she saw none of it, lost in thought, softened, tender, wrapped in the recent delights. She hugged herself, as if to hold them in, the way one might keep a silken garment from slipping, because its fabric feels too sweet against the skin. The cab rolled past a church. She saw the heavy, dark main doors so forbidding they seemed destined never to open, and to the right a low side entrance left slightly ajar. As though struck suddenly by a thought, something yet untried, her gaze lit up beneath the veil. A quick, bright glint, strange in eyes so gentle, the first flicker of desire or curiosity flaring to life, and at the same moment a smile curled on her lips, sly, cruel, faintly mocking, yet still lovely. "Driver, stop here!" she called out. Hastily, she tucked the corset back beneath her cloak, stepped down from the carriage and entered the nearly empty church. 3 old women knelt inside, their bulky skirts soaked at the hem with street grime, thick black souls peeking out as they murmured prayers near a confessional. Just then a young priest, tall, thin, severe, was emerging from the sacristy and moving toward the tribunal of penitents. The little Baroness knelt at a prie-dieu a little off to the side, waiting her turn. Her face was buried in a handkerchief, presumably examining her conscience. She was, by all appearances, very pious. Why not? Can one not be a good Christian simply because she once loved too well? Remorse, alas, follows closely on the heels of joy. One repents of sin with the same fervour with which it was committed. One is sincere with God as one was with a lover. Lips that once murmured mad and guilty words now long to utter confessions that beg for mercy. The memory of rapture calls forth the need for mortification, and heaven, whose mercy infinite, does not turn away penitent sinners. No, not even when they come barely escaped from sin, seeking to cleanse themselves at the source of all grace. Not even when their sudden repentance leaves behind, in the house of God, the faint, lingering perfume of the boudoir. Indeed, the moment the Baroness knelt before the confessor, there arose from her, within that quiet corner of the church, a disquieting fragrance of desire not quite extinguished. The scent of ylang-ylang, far too provocative for such a place, mingled inappropriately with the sacred dull sweetness of incense. As she bowed her velvety pink forehead with an exaggerated humility, she smudged the mesh of the confessional grill with her powder. And she ought, above all, to have hidden the corset she was holding, unsure what to do with it, still steeped in the perfume of remembered pleasures, clasped between hands ostensibly folded in prayer. But her contrition, her devotion, absorbed her to such a degree that she had no time to be troubled by such details. With a fervent humility, already chastising herself through confession, she declared her fault after the requisite words had been exchanged. "After resisting for so long," she said, "I finally gave in and went to him that evening, to the man I loved, and at first he knelt before me, whispering tender words, reminding me of the ball where we'd first danced together, me, so pale, full-figured, bare-armed, my neckline low, pressing the living warmth of my breasts against the black of his coat as we turned and turned." She broke off, then added softly, "I was already guilty." After a few seconds of silence, it seemed as though he needed to catch his breath, the priest replied, "The mercy of God is infinite." Emboldened, she went on, "He kept speaking to me, more ardently. Would he not see again those shoulders everyone had once admired, but this time for him alone? Would he not kiss the arms whose embrace, he said, would wrap heaven around his neck? For he blasphemed, Father, and still kneeling, he kissed my fingers, my nails. He tried to part, oh, I blush, the lace at my sleeves. I should have fled. I could not. I was conquered, and gently yielding as he drew me into his arms, I let my head fall back on the chair, my eyes filled with tears of consent." She broke off again. "Alas, God will never absolve me." This time there was no reply. Had the confessor, scandalized, withdrawn? She could not see. Her face was buried in her hands, pressed against the corset. But no, she could hear it, close to her, the stifled breath of a chest labouring under strain. The enormity of her sin had shaken the young priest to the core, and at last, very softly, very slowly, in a voice trembling with the effort of supreme charity, he said, "Do not despair, my child." And again she spoke, in the overflowing rapture of repentance. Devoutly cruel toward herself, she spared her modesty none of the painful admissions. She recounted all the abominable delights of the adulterous bed, the cunning of perverse love, the caresses whispered by that swarm of wicked angels who swim among the folds of bed curtains, and how these pleasures were renewed again and again until dawn itself, slipping through the lace, came to press its own kisses upon their pale lips. She told it all, everything, abundantly, at length, with the wild fervour of a maddened penitent, and with the minute precision of a casuist, until finally, overcome by terror at the thought of her eternal damnation, she broke into sobs and soaked with desperate tears the satin and plush of the black and pink corset. The confessor said nothing, but the horror her sin had awakened in him must have been overwhelming, for she heard the sound of a man catching himself against the wall, just at the point of collapse. Then came a single severe command, "Leave, madam." She obeyed, weeping all the while. But as she crossed the nave, where the rustling of her skirts offended the austere silence of the stone, there was in her eyes and at the corners of her lips beneath the veil that wicked little smile of hers. Just as she was about to push open the door, she turned, her gaze drawn to a side altar by a painting that showed Satan whispering into Jesus' ear upon the mount. A shaft of sunlight, filtered through stained glass, lit the demon's face, brought it to life, and one could truly believe that the tempter of God was offering the little baroness a smile of approval. She hurried away, stifling a laugh, her nose buried in her muff. As for the corset, she had left it behind in the confessional.